She had no idea that the $92,000 loan she had taken out in my name, using a forged signature, a copied driver's license, and a bank loan officer who had not, in fact, verified anything as carefully as his own institution's compliance policy required, would eventually sit on a table in a Montgomery County courtroom in Dayton, Ohio, in front of a judge who had spent 18 years on the bench specifically hearing financial fraud cases, and who would ask my sister exactly one question that she did not have a single rehearsed answer for. My sister used my name on a $92,000 loan. She told the bank it was for a small business expansion. She spent it on a car, a vacation, and 3 months of rent on an apartment I had never seen. This is the story of what happened when the bank finally called to confirm my business, and what a judge asked her 11 months later that she could not find a way to answer. My name is Lorraine Achebe. I am 36 years old. I am a forensic accountant at a regional accounting firm in Dayton, Ohio, where I have spent 12 years specializing in fraud investigation, loan documentation analysis, and the specific, methodical work of reconstructing exactly how and when a financial deception occurred, who authorized what, and what the paper trail actually shows once you strip away every assumption anyone involved would prefer you to make instead. I tell you my profession first, because it is, in the most literal sense possible, the reason this story has the ending it has. My sister did not commit fraud against a stranger. She committed it against the one person in our family whose entire career consists of catching exactly the kind of things she did. My sister's name is Lorraine Achebe Whitfield. She is 39 years old, 3 years older than me, and for most of my life, I would have described our relationship as close. Not without friction, the way most sibling relationships carry friction, but fundamentally close, built on a childhood spent navigating our parents' difficult divorce together, supporting each other through the specific instability of a household that reorganized itself twice before either of us turned 15. Denise had spent the decade before this story unfolding in a pattern of escalating financial difficulty that I had watched, with growing concern, from the specific vantage point of someone whose professional training makes financial distress legible in ways that family members without that training sometimes miss. She had divorced 4 years earlier, a process that had been financially costly in ways that extended well beyond the legal fees. She had started, and eventually closed, a small event planning business that had never achieved sustainable profitability. She had, in the 2 years before the events of this story, taken out 2 personal loans from different lenders, both of which she had eventually fallen behind on, with the second resulting in a collections process that I learned about, secondhand, through our mother. I had helped Denise financially on 3 separate occasions over the preceding decade. Not large amounts, but meaningful ones. $4,000 toward a car repair, when her transmission failed, and she had no way to get to work otherwise. $2,800 to cover a security deposit, when she needed to move quickly after her divorce, and approximately $6,000 over an 18-month period, in smaller increments toward what she described, each time as just a temporary gap in her monthly expenses. I want to establish clearly that I had been a willing and consistent source of support for my sister, within reasonable limits, for years before what happened. This matters because the simplest version of this story would suggest that Denise turned to fraud because I had been withholding or unsupportive. That was not the case. I had given what I could give, when asked directly, through legitimate means. What changed in the months before this story's central events was not my willingness to help. It was Denise's apparent decision that asking through legitimate means had become too slow, too limited, or too likely to receive a no for the amount she had decided she needed. I need to plant several details here that matter significantly to what follows. The first, approximately 18 months before the loan, Denise had asked me directly whether I would co-sign a loan with her, a formal, legitimate request made over dinner at her apartment, for an amount she described as being in the range of $30,000, intended, she said, to to consolidate her existing debts into a single, more manageable monthly payment. I had declined. I had explained my reasoning clearly. Co-signing a loan meant I would become legally and financially responsible for the full amount if she defaulted. And given her recent payment history on the 2 prior personal loans, I was not comfortable accepting that level of risk, regardless of how much I loved her or wanted to help her stabilize her finances. I had offered instead to help her find a credit counseling service that specialized in debt consolidation without requiring a cosigner, and to continue providing the kind of smaller, direct support I had already been providing when genuine emergencies arose. Denise had been frustrated by this response, though not, at the time, in a way that struck me as anything beyond ordinary sibling disappointment. She had said, at the time, "I just thought you of all people would understand the numbers well enough to know I'm not actually that big a risk," a comment I noted, in retrospect, as the first indication that she believed my professional understanding of risk should somehow translate into personal generosity regarding that same risk, rather than informing my caution about it. The second detail. I had, several years earlier, helped Denise set up her event planning business's initial financial structure, opening a business banking account, establishing basic bookkeeping practices, and walking her through the documentation a small business typically needs for tax purposes and for any future financing it might require. In the course of this work, I had reviewed and retained copies of several of her identifying documents: her driver's license, her social security card, business formation paperwork, because she had asked me to handle the initial business registration on her behalf while she focused on launching her actual services. I had returned the originals to her once the registration was complete. I had not realized until considerably later that I had retained digital scans of several of these documents in a folder on my personal cloud storage, created during that period of helping her, which I had simply never deleted because there had never been any reason to think about deleting them. This detail matters because it explains, in part, how Denise was eventually able to access a clear, high-quality copy of my own driver's license, not through any sophisticated hacking or identity theft scheme, but through something considerably more mundane and, in its own way, more painful. She had, at some point in the 18 months following her co-signing request, gained access to my cloud storage account, using a password she had known from years earlier, when we had shared a streaming service account, and I had, carelessly, reused the same password across multiple accounts without updating it. I want to be honest about my own role in creating this vulnerability, because precision matters more to me, telling this story, than protecting my own image as a flawless victim. I am a forensic accountant. I understand, professionally, the importance of password hygiene and account security. I had nonetheless reused an old password across accounts out of the same ordinary human laziness that affects nearly everyone, and that laziness created the specific access point my sister eventually used. The third detail. Approximately 4 months before the loan was taken out, Denise had mentioned, during a phone call, that she was exploring some new opportunities related to a potential small business venture. Something involving catering equipment rental, a pivot from her event planning background that she described in vague but enthusiastic terms. I had asked some clarifying questions out of genuine interest, and she had been notably evasive about specifics, which I noted at the time as slightly unusual for Denise, who was typically eager to discuss her business ideas in considerable detail, but which I did not, in the moment, recognize as significant. There is a particular kind of vulnerability that exists at the intersection of family trust and ordinary digital carelessness. A password never updated, documents shared years earlier for a legitimate purpose, and simply never deleted, identifying information that exists quietly, in places we forget to examine until someone we never expected decides to examine them on our behalf. I learned about the loan on a Thursday afternoon in June, when I received a call from a loan servicing representative at Heartland Community Bank, a mid-sized regional institution in the Dayton area, confirming, as she described it, a routine business verification check related to an account under my name. I want to describe my exact reaction to this call with precision, because the specific professional instincts that activated in that moment are the entire reason this story resolved the way it eventually did. "I don't have any active accounts with Heartland," I said. "Can you tell me what account you're referring to?" The representative, whose name was Carla, explained that she was calling regarding a small business loan, originated 4 months earlier, in the amount of $92,000, under the name Lorraine Achebe, associated with a business listed as Achebe Premium Events and Equipment LLC, and that the bank's quarterly compliance review process had flagged the account for a routine follow-up verification, given that the business address listed did not match any commercial property registration. The bank's automated systems had been able to confirm independently. I sat very still at my desk. "I have never applied for a loan with Heartland Community Bank," I said. "I have never heard of a business called Achebe Premium Events and Equipment. I need you to stop this call and connect me directly with your fraud department, immediately." Carla, to her credit, recognized the gravity of what I had just said, and transferred me promptly to the bank's Fraud and Security Division, where I spent the next 90 minutes providing a formal statement, confirming my identity through multiple independent verification methods, and beginning, in real time, the process of documenting exactly what had happened. A process that my professional training made considerably more efficient than it would have been for someone without my specific background, though no less devastating to actually live through. What emerged over the following days, through both the bank's internal investigation and my own parallel professional reconstruction of events, was the following sequence. 4 months earlier, an application had been submitted to Heartland Community Bank for a small business loan in the amount of $92,000 under the name Lorraine Achebe, listing a business entity called Achebe Premium Events and Equipment LLC, a business name I had never registered, using a structure deliberately similar to my actual last name, combined with language reminiscent of Denise's prior event planning business, in what I can only assume was an attempt to make the entity sound plausible to anyone giving it a cursory glance. The application had included a copy of my driver's license. The scanned image I had retained, unknowingly vulnerable, in my cloud storage account, along with a social security number that matched mine, business formation documents for an LLC that had in fact been formally registered with the Ohio Secretary of State's office 3 weeks before the loan application, using my name as the listed organizer and registered agent, at an address that turned out to be a UPS mailbox rental rather than any actual commercial location. The loan had been approved within 11 days, funded directly into a business checking account opened in my name at the same bank, using the same fraudulent documentation, and the funds had been withdrawn and transferred, over the following weeks, through a series of transactions that my forensic analysis, once I obtained the account records through the fraud investigation process, traced with complete clarity to Denise's actual personal accounts and several specific, identifiable expenditures, a down payment, and several months of lease payments on a vehicle registered to Denise. A vacation booking, including flights and a resort stay in Mexico, charged to a credit card linked to Denise's email address, and 3 months of rent payments to an apartment complex in a different part of Dayton than where Denise had previously lived, which I would later learn she had moved into, quietly, without informing most of our family. Approximately 6 weeks after the loan funded, I sat with my own forensic reconstruction of this timeline for a long time before I called my mother, because I needed first to be completely certain of what the evidence actually showed before I said anything to anyone that might later need to be walked back or qualified. I am, by professional discipline, a person who does not state conclusions before the evidence supports them completely. I held that discipline, even in the worst, most personally painful application of it I have ever had to manage. I called my mother on a Saturday, 4 days after the bank's initial call, once I had a complete enough picture to explain what had happened clearly. Denise took out a loan in my name, I said. $92,000, using a forged business registration and a stolen copy of my driver's license. She spent it on a car, a vacation, and an apartment. My mother was silent for a long moment. "Are you certain?" she said eventually, in a voice that carried the specific, desperate hope of a parent looking for any possible alternative explanation before accepting the one being presented. "I am completely certain," I said. "I have reviewed the account records myself professionally, the same way I would review evidence for any client's fraud case. The documentation is unambiguous." "I'm not speculating, Mom. I'm reporting what I have already verified." "Have you talked to her?" my mother asked. "Not yet," I said. I wanted to understand the full scope before I had that conversation, because I expect her to minimize or explain it away, and I wanted to already know exactly what the evidence shows before she has a chance to shape my understanding of it. "What are you going to do?" my mother said. "I'm going to call her," I said. "And then, depending on how that conversation goes, I'm going to involve the bank's fraud department formally, and likely law enforcement. This is not a family disagreement I can resolve over dinner, Mom. This is a federal crime. Identity theft and loan fraud, committed against me by my own sister, and I owe it to myself, professionally and personally, to treat it with the seriousness it actually requires, regardless of how painful that is for the family." I called Denise that same evening. She answered with the breezy, slightly distracted tone she often used on calls, the tone of someone who had not yet registered that this particular call was going to be different from any prior conversation between us. "Hey," she said. "What's up?" "I got a call from Heartland Community Bank," I said, "about a $92,000 loan in my name, for a business called Achebe Premium Events and Equipment, that I never registered and never applied for." The silence on the line lasted long enough that I counted it, internally, the specific professional habit of noting exact intervals that my training had made automatic even in the worst moments of my own life. "Lorraine," she said eventually. "I can explain. I'm listening," I said. "I want you to know, before you start, that I have already reviewed the bank's records. I know about the apartment. I know about the car. I know about the trip to Mexico. I'm not asking you to explain because I don't understand what happened. I'm asking because I want to hear what you say, and I want to be honest that I am recording this call." "You're recording me?" she said, her voice shifting from defensive uncertainty to something closer to alarm. "Yes," I said. "I told you I'm recording it. That's not a secret tactic. That's me being transparent about what's happening, the same way I'd want to be treated if our positions were reversed. I need an accurate record of this conversation, because I expect, eventually, that an accurate record of this conversation is going to matter considerably more than either of our memories of it." Denise did not respond to this directly. Instead, she pivoted to the explanation she had apparently prepared, in some form, for the possibility of exactly this conversation. "I was going to pay it back," she said. "I always intended to pay it back. I was going through such a hard time, Lorraine, and I knew you would never approve the amount I actually needed. And I panicked, and I used information I already had access to from when I set up the business years ago, and I told myself it was temporary, that I'd find a way to repay it before you ever even had to know." "You stole my identity," I said. "That is the accurate description of what you did. Not used information I already had access to. You forged my signature, registered a fraudulent business in my name, and obtained a loan you had no intention of disclosing to me, that I am now legally responsible for unless I can establish, through a formal fraud process, that I did not authorize it." "I know how it sounds," she said. "It doesn't just sound like fraud," I said. "It is fraud. Specifically and legally. I need you to actually absorb that, rather than continuing to describe it in language that makes it sound like an unfortunate accident rather than a deliberate, planned act that took weeks to execute." There was another long silence. "What happens now?" she said, finally, in a voice considerably smaller than the one she had opened the call with. I am going to report this formally to the bank's fraud department, I said, and to law enforcement. I am going to need you to repay every dollar, with whatever penalties and interest the legal process determines are appropriate, and I am not going to protect you from the consequences simply because you're my sister. I love you. I am also not willing to carry $92,000 of fraudulent debt or a permanently damaged credit history because you decided my identity was a resource available for you to use without my knowledge. There is a particular kind of clarity that arrives when you finally stop trying to reconcile the person you love with the specific, documented thing they did, and simply allow both facts to exist at once. She is my sister, and she committed a serious crime against me. Neither fact erases the other. Both facts require their own response. I filed a formal identity theft report with the Federal Trade Commission within 48 hours of the initial call, generating the specific identity theft, affidavit, and case number that would become essential to every subsequent step of disentangling myself from the fraudulent loan. I filed a police report with the Dayton Police Department's Financial Crimes Unit, providing the full documentation I had already assembled through my own professional reconstruction of the loan's timeline. I retained an attorney, a criminal defense and consumer fraud specialist named Gabriel Okonkwo-Reyes, recommended to me by a colleague at my firm who had handled the business side of several identity theft cases and understood the specific intersection of civil and criminal exposure I was navigating. You're in an unusually strong position for a victim of this kind of fraud, Gabriel told me in our first meeting, reviewing the documentation I had already assembled. Most identity theft victims spend months trying to even establish the basic timeline of what happened, because they don't have the professional background to reconstruct financial records efficiently. You walked in here with a complete forensic timeline, bank-grade documentation, and a recorded confession. The bank's own compliance failure, failing to verify the business address discrepancy before funding $92,000. Also gives you a strong civil claim against Heartland directly, separate from your sister's criminal liability. I'm not interested in suing the bank into bankruptcy, I said. I want the fraudulent loan removed from my credit history and my legal record entirely, and I want my sister held accountable through the appropriate criminal process. I'm not trying to extract maximum financial damages from every party involved. That's a reasonable position, Gabriel said. And given the strength of your documentation, it's also an achievable one. The bank is going to want to resolve their compliance failure quietly and quickly, once they understand the full scope of what their own verification process missed. Your sister's situation is going to be considerably more complicated, because identity theft and loan fraud at this dollar amount is a felony in Ohio, and the bank's own investigation, once formally documented, is likely to result in a referral to county or federal prosecutors, regardless of what you personally want to happen to her. I understand that, I said. I'm not asking the system to be gentler with her than the facts warrant. I'm simply telling you what my own personal priorities are, going into this process. The bank's internal investigation concluded within 6 weeks, resulting in a formal acknowledgement that their loan officer had failed to adequately verify the business address discrepancy that should have prevented the loan from funding in the first place. A compliance failure that, combined with my own documented identity theft report and the recorded confession, resulted in the bank agreeing to remove the fraudulent loan from my credit history entirely, absorb the financial loss themselves, rather than pursuing any collection against me, and refer the matter formally to the Montgomery County Prosecutor's Office for criminal charges against Denise. I want to note, because it matters to understanding exactly how this kind of fraud is actually prosecuted, that the decision to pursue criminal charges was not, ultimately, mine to make. Once a financial institution formally documents fraud above a certain dollar threshold, the referral to prosecutors becomes part of the bank's own regulatory compliance obligations, regardless of what the victim personally wants. I had some input, through my attorney, into the framing of my own victim impact statement, but the actual decision to charge, and the specific charges pursued, belonged to the prosecutor's office. Operating on the evidence the bank's investigation and my own documentation had established, Denise was charged with identity theft and loan fraud under Ohio law. Charges that, given the dollar amount involved, carried the possibility of significant prison time upon conviction. She retained her own attorney, a public defender initially, before our mother, in a decision I understood but did not entirely agree with, contributed funds toward private counsel. A choice I did not attempt to block, because I had decided, early in this process, that my responsibility was to establish the truth accurately and pursue appropriate accountability, not to control every downstream decision other family members made about how to support Denise through the consequences of her own actions. The case proceeded toward trial over the following 11 months, a timeline that included extensive discovery, several procedural hearings, and a plea negotiation process that ultimately broke down when Denise's attorney attempted to argue, in pretrial motions, that the loan represented a family financial arrangement rather than fraud, a characterization the prosecutor's office rejected outright, given the forged signature, fraudulent business registration, and the complete absence of any communication to me, at any point, indicating I was aware of or had consented to the loan. I testified at the trial, in October, in the Montgomery County Court of Common Pleas, before a judge named Patricia Ansh Nakamura, who had, according to my attorney's briefing before the proceedings, spent 18 years on the bench with a specific professional reputation for financial crimes cases, having previously served as a prosecutor in the county's Economic Crimes Unit before her judicial appointment. I testified for approximately 90 minutes, walking the court through the forensic timeline I had reconstructed, the cloud storage vulnerability, the fraudulent LLC registration, the forged signature on the loan application, the specific transactions tracing the funds from the fraudulent business account into Denise's personal expenditures. I presented my testimony with the same methodical, evidence-based precision I would have brought to presenting any client's fraud case, because I had decided, early in this process, that emotional performance would serve neither the truth nor my own dignity, as well as simply, clearly, accurately describing what had happened and what the evidence showed. Denise testified in her own defense, 2 days later, offering an account that emphasized her financial desperation, her genuine intention to repay the loan, and her characterization of the act as borrowing, repeatedly. A word her attorney appeared to have specifically coached her to use throughout her testimony, given how consistently she returned to it, regardless of the actual question being asked. It was during the prosecutor's cross-examination, and then, more decisively, during a specific moment when Judge Nakamura herself interjected with a direct question, that the actual weight of what Denise had done became undeniable, even to the small number of family members present in the courtroom who had, up to that point, continued to hold some hope that the situation might resolve as something less serious than what the documentation actually established. The prosecutor asked Denise to explain why, if she genuinely viewed the loan as borrowing rather than fraud, she had never once, at any point in the 4 months between the loan funding and my discovery of it, mentioned the loan's existence to me, despite multiple phone calls and family gatherings during that period. Denise offered an answer about finding the right moment and not wanting to worry me prematurely. Language that struck me, even as I sat listening, as considerably less convincing than it had perhaps sounded when she rehearsed it with her attorney. Judge Nakamura, at this point, looked up from the documents in front of her. According to my attorney's later account, an unusual departure from her typical practice of allowing attorneys to conduct their own examinations without judicial interjection, except on matters of procedure, and asked Denise a single question, directly, in a voice my attorney described afterward as carrying no particular hostility, simply the specific clarifying precision of someone who had spent 18 years learning exactly which question actually mattered in cases like this one. Ms. Whitfield, Judge Nakamura said, if this was genuinely a loan between sisters, structured as a borrowing arrangement you intended to honor, can you tell me what interest rate, repayment schedule, or any other term of repayment you and your sister had agreed to before you submitted the application? The courtroom was silent. Denise did not answer immediately. According to my attorney, who was watching her closely, several seconds passed, long enough that the silence itself became its own kind of testimony, before she said, quietly, we hadn't discussed specific terms yet. You hadn't discussed any terms, Judge Nakamura said. It was not quite a question, not the interest rate, not the repayment schedule, not the amount. Your sister was entirely unaware the loan existed until a bank representative called her directly, 4 months after the funds had already been spent. Yes, Your Honor, Denise said. Then I want to understand, Judge Nakamura said. What makes this a borrowing arrangement, as opposed to simply taking $92,000 that did not belong to you, using a false identity to obtain it? Denise did not have an answer to this. My attorney told me, afterward, that the specific quality of her silence in that moment, not defiant, not tearful, simply empty, the silence of someone who had finally run out of language capable of reframing what had actually happened, was, in his 18 years of trial experience, one of the more decisive moments he had witnessed in a courtroom, more decisive, in its way, than any single piece of documentary evidence had been, because it represented the defendant's own inability, under direct and simple questioning from the bench, to sustain the narrative her entire defense had been built around. There is a particular kind of question that does not require aggression to be devastating. It requires only the simple act of asking the defendant to provide the one piece of evidence that would actually support the story she has been telling, and discovering, in the silence that follows, that the evidence has never existed because the story was never true to begin with. Denise was convicted on both counts, identity theft and loan fraud, 3 weeks later, following the jury's deliberation. The sentencing hearing, held the following month, resulted in a sentence of 18 months in a state correctional facility, followed by 3 years of supervised probation, along with a restitution order requiring her to repay the full $92,000, plus accumulated interest and legal costs, to Heartland Community Bank, which had already absorbed the loss on my behalf and was now the formal party to whom restitution was owed. I provided a victim impact statement at the sentencing hearing, which I had drafted carefully, in consultation with Gabriel, to convey the actual harm I had experienced. The months of professional and personal disruption required to disentangle myself from a fraud committed in my name, the specific violation of having a family member exploit the trust, inherent in years of shared financial history, the broader damage to my sense of safety, regarding which relationships in my life actually operated on a foundation of honesty. Without descending into the kind of vindictive language that I did not believe would serve either the court's understanding of the harm or my own dignity in describing it, I did not ask the court for the maximum available sentence. I asked, instead, for a sentence that reflected the actual seriousness of what had occurred, paired with a restitution structure that gave Denise a realistic path to eventually repaying what she owed. Because I had decided, throughout this process, that my goal was accountability rather than maximum punishment. A distinction that mattered enormously to me, even as I recognized that the actual sentence imposed was not, ultimately, something I controlled. My relationship with Denise, in the time since her conviction, exists in a form I would not have been able to predict before any of this happened, and that I continue to navigate with considerable care. I have visited her twice during her incarceration, in conversations that have been honest in ways our relationship had not always been honest before. Not comfortable, exactly, but accurate, built on a shared acknowledgement of what actually happened, rather than the kind of softened, family-preserving narrative that I think both of us might have been tempted to construct if the legal process had not forced a more complete reckoning. I keep trying to understand why I thought it would work, she told me, during my second visit, in the specific, stripped-down honesty that I have noticed often develops in people once the elaborate justifications they constructed during the actual commission of a crime have finally collapsed under the weight of formal consequence. I think I told myself, somewhere along the way, that because we were sisters, and because I knew you'd eventually help me if I asked directly for less, the gap between asking directly and just taking what I actually needed didn't feel as large as it should have felt. I think I convinced myself it was sort of the same thing, just faster. It was not the same thing, I said. Asking is a request I get to answer. What you did removed my ability to answer anything. That's the entire distinction, and I think you understood it the whole time, even while you were telling yourself otherwise. I think I did too, she said. I just didn't want to look at it directly until I didn't have a choice anymore. I do not know, as I tell this story, what my relationship with Denise will look like once her probation concludes, and the restitution payments, which she has begun making in modest monthly increments from the wages she earns in a prison work program, are eventually completed. I have chosen for now to maintain contact, not because I have minimized what she did, and not because I have fully resolved the specific grief of discovering that a person I trusted completely had been capable of exactly this kind of calculated violation, but because I believe, based on the conversations we have had since her conviction, that something genuine has shifted in how she understands what trust actually requires. And I am willing to continue observing that shift carefully, over time, before deciding what role, if any, it will eventually play in our future relationship. I changed every password across every account I hold within the first week of discovering the fraud. Not simply the cloud storage account that had contained my scanned documents, but every account using unique, complex credentials for each one. Managed through a password manager, I now use with the same professional rigor I bring to verifying any client's financial documentation. I deleted every stored copy of sensitive identifying documents from any cloud-based storage, retaining only encrypted offline backups that no remote access credential could ever expose again. I think, often, about the specific moment Carla from Heartland Community Bank's loan servicing department called me on an ordinary Thursday afternoon. With the bland, procedural language of a routine business verification check, and how close that entire conversation came to going differently, if the bank's automated systems had not happened to flag the business address discrepancy. If I had been traveling and missed the call, if I had been even slightly less immediately suspicious, and had simply assumed it was some kind of error, rather than recognizing, within seconds, that something was fundamentally wrong. I think about how completely my professional training shaped every subsequent decision, the instinct to verify before reacting, to document before confronting, to record the confrontation itself rather than relying on memory, to retain counsel who understood exactly which battles were worth fighting and which would simply consume resources without changing the outcome. I think, too, about Judge Nakamura's single question and how completely it exposed, in under 30 seconds, what 11 months of legal proceedings and 90 minutes of my own forensic testimony, and an entire defense strategy built around the word borrowing, had all been circling around, without ever quite naming directly, that a loan requires two people who have agreed to its terms, and Denise had never, at any point, secured my agreement to anything, because securing it had never actually been her plan. The most devastating question is rarely the most complicated one. It is simply the question that asks a person to produce the one piece of evidence that would make their story true, and the absence of that evidence, when finally asked for directly, speaks more clearly than any amount of testimony built around avoiding the question in the first place. And that was the year I understood that my sister had not simply made a desperate, isolated mistake under financial pressure. She had made a series of careful, sequential decisions, retaining documents, learning a password, registering a fraudulent business, forging a signature, waiting months to see if discovery would happen before it inevitably did. Each one requiring its own specific choice to continue rather than stop, across a timeline long enough that no single moment of panic could fully explain the whole. I had spent 12 years learning to read exactly this kind of timeline for other people's families, in other people's fraud cases, understanding the patient, sequential nature of financial deception, in a way most people never have professional occasion to develop. I never expected to need that specific expertise applied to my own sister. I am grateful, even now, even through everything this has cost both of us, that when I needed it, I had it, fully developed, completely reliable, and exactly precise enough to answer, clearly and without doubt, the only question that ever actually mattered. What happened? When did it happen? And who is responsible for what the record shows? The record showed everything. It was enough.